On the coast of Florida stands a palace that looks like a fairy tale made of gold and marble. This is the dark story of America's most controversial mansion, Mar-a-Lago. At first, it was the dream of one woman, Marjorie Merriweather Post. She built Mar-a-Lago as her eternal throne, a banquet hall where laughter echoed while the country was going through the Great Depression, wars, and poverty. Here, crystal chandeliers shone brighter than the hope of many Americans. But this house was never just a beautiful villa. Within its walls gathered those who had the power to change the course of history. At first, glamorous dinners and subtle diplomacy of the Cold War era. Then the palace passed to a future president. And Mar-a-Lago became not only a club for the rich, but also a symbol of struggle, scandal, and the anger of half the country. In the same halls where toasts for peace once sounded, people now discuss secret documents, court cases, and political battles. How did one golden palace turn from a fairy tale refuge into an arena of dark deals, broken lives, and dangerous secrets? And what truth is still hidden behind its heavy doors? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. 1. The heiress who had everything except belonging. Thank you for being here. The building rises from the Florida shoreline like something transported from another century, another continent entirely. 128 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, gold leaf ceilings that catch the morning sun, marble floors shipped across an ocean. This is Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake. Stretching from the Atlantic to the Intracoastal Waterway, 17 acres of what was meant to be paradise. But before it became a private club, before it housed a president, before the protests and the headlines and the federal investigations, it was one woman's answer to a question she could never quite escape. How do you buy your way into a world that does not want you? This is the story of that mansion. And the story begins, as so many American stories do, with money. Spectacular amounts of it, and the strange way wealth can open nearly every door and still leave the most important ones firmly closed. Let us begin with Marjorie Merriweather Post. Born in 1887, Marjorie inherited the Postum Cereal Company, later General Foods, when her father died in 1914. She was 27 years old. Overnight, she became one of the wealthiest women in America. The exact figure shifted with the markets, but by the early 1920s, her fortune was estimated in the tens of millions of dollars, the equivalent of many billions today. Money bought her multiple estates. Money bought her yachts. Money bought her art collections that would eventually fill museums. Money even helped her find 4 husbands. Though notably, it could not keep any of them. Yet money could not buy her the one thing she wanted most: unquestioned acceptance into America's oldest, most exclusive social circles. The problem was simple and for her almost impossible to solve. Marjorie was new money. Her fortune came from cereal, from breakfast foods sold in boxes to ordinary Americans. This was not railroad money, not banking money, not the kind of wealth built slowly over generations by families whose names appeared in history books. The Astors looked down on her. The Vanderbilts were polite but distant. At Newport, at the most prestigious gatherings, Marjorie always felt an invisible wall. She received invitations, of course. She was far too rich to be shut out completely, but she was never entirely inside. The rejection stung. Marjorie had impeccable taste. She collected Russian imperial treasures, French furniture, Renaissance paintings. She entertained lavishly. She was generous, cultured, educated. None of it seemed to matter. Old society had its rules, and one of them went like this. Serial money was not serious money. To understand Marjorie's decision to build Mar-a-Lago, you have to understand that wound. The mansion was not simply a winter home. It was a statement, an argument made in marble and gold. You may not accept me, but you will never be able to ignore this. The location itself was a calculated choice. Palm Beach in the 1920s was already becoming the winter playground of wealthy Northerners. The climate was perfect. The coastline was spectacular, but the grand houses that lined the island mostly belonged to the very families who made Marjorie feel like an outsider. So she decided she would build something bigger, something more breathtaking, something that made their mansions look almost modest by comparison. The decision to commission Mar-a-Lago was made sometime in 1924. Marjorie purchased the land, a narrow strip of the Palm Beach barrier island, for approximately $1.5 million, a staggering sum for the era. The property was unique. It stretched from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to Lake Worth on the west, hence the Spanish name meaning sea to lake. She hired architects Marion Sims Wyeth and Joseph Urban. Her instructions were precise and bold. She wanted a Spanish Moorish palace that nodded to the great estates of Europe while being distinctly, undeniably American in its scale and confidence. She wanted imported tiles from the 1920s Seville Exposition. She wanted gold leaf on the ceilings. She wanted a tower visible from the ocean. She wanted, in short, to build something that no one could dismiss. Construction began in 1925. The work would take 4 years. 2. Building a fantasy. The price in stone and sweat. The work took years. Between 1925 and 1929, Mar-a-Lago rose slowly from the sandy ground of Palm Beach. The construction was not simply building a house. It was importing an entire imagined world, piece by piece, across oceans and continents. Marjorie's architects worked from her vision, but that vision demanded materials Florida did not have. The project called for 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, bought from estates and demolished buildings across Spain. Stone for the exterior walls came from quarries that had supplied Mediterranean palaces centuries earlier. Carved wooden ceilings were commissioned from craftsmen in Italy. The dining room table, one single massive piece, was so heavy that the floor beneath it had to be reinforced. The scale was extraordinary even by Gilded Age standards. The main house alone covered 62,500 square feet. The tower, visible for miles, rose into the Florida sky like a beacon, or a challenge. There were 75 rooms in the original design, a number that would grow over time. Every detail reflected Marjorie's precise idea of grandeur. Hand-painted tiles in the bathrooms, silk wall coverings in the bedrooms, a gold and white ballroom large enough to hold hundreds of guests. Yet Mar-a-Lago was not only the glittering palace everyone saw. To grasp its true size, you have to understand what lay beneath and behind it, an invisible city built to keep the fantasy running. The mansion required an army to function. Kitchens sprawled below ground, connected to the main house by service corridors, hidden from the eyes of guests. Industrial-scale refrigeration rooms stored food for elaborate dinners. Laundries handled the endless flow of linens. Mechanical rooms, scientists housed the boilers and pumps that made the dream livable, including air conditioning in the 1920s, a luxury almost unheard of, especially in Florida. The staff quarters formed a separate, closed world of their own. Dozens of workers lived on site: cooks, maids, groundskeepers, mechanics, drivers, personal secretaries. During the season, the estate employed between 50 and 60 people, all of them necessary to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. This parallel world was designed to remain out of sight. Service staircases allowed workers to move through the house without crossing the main halls. Kitchen entrances faced away from the formal gardens. Marjorie wanted perfection, but she wanted it to appear weightless, almost magical. Never the result of hard, visible labor. The building of Mar-a-Lago relied on hundreds more people long before the first party was ever held. Local laborers, many of them Black and Hispanic men working for wages that barely covered basic needs, did the heaviest work. Skilled craftsmen came from Europe and from the northern United States. The exact number varies in different accounts, but payroll records suggest the workforce peaked at more than 200 people during the most intense construction phases. The conditions were punishing. Florida heat and humidity made outdoor work exhausting. Sandstone dust hung in the air. The delicate installation of imported tiles demanded precision under pressure, because every delay meant cost overruns Marjorie's managers refused to accept. Injuries were reportedly common. Falls from scaffolding, cuts from stone and glass, cases of heat exhaustion. These workers built something magnificent. Their names, with only a few exceptions, have disappeared from the record. The cost was staggering. Estimates differ, but most historians place the construction bill between $7 and $10 million. Well over $150 million in today's money. And that figure covered only the building itself, not the furnishings, not the art Marjorie would eventually bring in, not the constant maintenance that would swallow additional millions over the following decades. Timing made everything even more striking. Mar-a-Lago was completed in 1929, the same year the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. While Marjorie entertained in her ballroom, bread lines formed in American cities. While her staff served elaborate dinners on gold-trimmed china, families elsewhere struggled to afford basic meals. The contrast was brutal, impossible to ignore, though many in Palm Beach society tried their best. Marjorie herself apparently never saw this contradiction as a moral problem. She believed sincerely that her fortune created jobs, that her spending kept money moving, that her patronage of artists and craftsmen served a wider good. Whether the men cutting stone in the Florida sun agreed with that view is something history does not record. The mansion opened for its first full season in early 1930. Marjorie welcomed friends, business partners, minor European nobility, and anyone whose presence might raise her social standing. The parties quickly became legendary. Orchestras played in the ballroom. Champagne flowed despite prohibition. The guest lists mixed names from Hollywood, Washington, and Wall Street. But the question that had driven the entire project still hung in the air. Had she finally created something grand enough to erase the invisible line between herself and the old families who, even now, quietly saw her as an outsider? The answer, slow and painful, would reveal itself in the years to come. 3. Gilded winters and the machinery. Beneath the Seasons at Mar-a-Lago followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork. Every November, Marjorie arrived from her estate in upstate New York or from her Washington residence. For weeks beforehand, the staff had been preparing. Every surface polished, every room aired and scrubbed, fresh flowers arranged in the entrance hall, the kitchen stocked with provisions for months of entertaining. By the time Marjorie's car passed through the gates, the mansion seemed to have been waiting, unchanged and perfect, for her return. The winter season began. The guest lists were crafted with care. Diplomats and their wives. Business titans whose fortunes rivaled or exceeded Marjorie's own. Actors and actresses whose names in the papers added a layer of glamour. And, when she could get them, genuine European aristocrats. Counts and countesses whose titles were real, whose family trees stretched back centuries, and whose presence Marjorie valued above almost any other. The dinners were productions, not just meals. 30 or 40 guests seated in the formal dining room, the table stretching beneath the carved ceiling. 7 courses, sometimes more. Wine pairings pulled from Marjorie's extensive cellars, crystal glasses catching candlelight. Conversation that moved carefully through safe topics, travel, art, society, gossip, while sidestepping anything too political, too controversial, too close to real conflict. After dinner, guests drifted to the ballroom or the living room. Sometimes there was dancing, sometimes card games. Always there was the feeling of being somewhere important, somewhere exclusive, a place that signaled you mattered. But beneath this choreography ran the machinery that made it all possible. While guests dined upstairs, the kitchens below operated with near-military precision. Head chefs commanded teams of sous chefs and prep cooks. Dishes moved from prep tables to stoves, to serving trays in tightly timed sequences. One course finished, plates cleared, the next course already waiting. The heat was relentless, gas ranges blazing, ovens at full temperature, steam rising from pots. And the pressure never eased. Kitchen staff worked 12-hour shifts during major events, sometimes longer. The pay was modest. The labor was heavy and often dangerous. Burns from hot pans and scalding water were routine. The schedule did not slow. Mistakes were noticed, and they were not forgiven easily. Beyond the kitchens, laundry rooms tackled mountains of linens. Every tablecloth, every napkin, every sheet from every guest bedroom had to be washed, pressed, and stored without a wrinkle. The work was hot, repetitive, and endless. The women who handled it, almost all of them women, arrived before dawn and left after dark in the busiest weeks. Outside, groundskeepers kept the 17 acres in immaculate condition, grass trimmed to exact heights, hedges shaped with geometric precision, palm, trees checked for disease and storm damage. The salt air ate at metal and stone, demanding constant repair. Equipment needed servicing. The ocean gnawed at the seawall, a steady, patient threat. Mechanical systems drew their own share of attention. Boilers heated water for dozens of bathrooms. Early air conditioning units fought a losing battle against Florida humidity and had to be coaxed along. Electrical systems were monitored to ensure the lights never failed during a crucial moment. Men worked in windowless rooms filled with the roar of machinery, watching gauges and adjusting valves to keep the illusion intact. The staff lived in a separate world, physically close but socially distant. Their quarters were comfortable by the standards of the time, better than many service jobs offered. Yet the boundary was firm. They entered the main house only through designated doors. They used specific staircases. They learned to move through rooms as if invisible, always present, rarely acknowledged. Marjorie herself seems to have treated her staff with what she believed was kindness. She remembered names. She asked about families. She gave Christmas bonuses and occasional gifts. By the standards of wealthy employers in the 1930s, she was considered fair, even generous. But fair and generous still meant a rigid hierarchy. It still meant workers who could not dream of sending their own children to the schools where Marjorie's grandchildren studied. It still meant a ballroom where staff could arrange flowers and polish floors, but never dance. The contrast was always there, even if few people named it aloud. Upstairs, guests in evening gowns sipped champagne and compared recent European travels. Downstairs, workers in sweat-stained uniforms hauled cases of wine and scrubbed cooking grease from industrial ranges. The mansion functioned because of this division. The fantasy depended on it. Guests came to Mar-a-Lago to escape the ordinary world, to step into a space where beauty felt effortless and abundance seemed natural. That illusion required invisible hands doing invisible work. On some evenings, after the last guests had gone to bed, after the final dishes were washed and the ballroom lights dimmed, Marjorie would walk through the darkened rooms alone. The silence then was different. Not the charged quiet before a party, but something heavier, emptier. The question she had built Mar-a-Lago to answer still lingered in that silence. Was this enough? Had she finally proven whatever needed proving? The walls, magnificent as they were, offered no reply. 4. The war years and the illusion of permanence. The world beyond Palm Beach was changing. By the late 1930s, Europe moved inexorably toward war. Hitler's Germany expanded. Mussolini's Italy grew more aggressive. The carefully maintained peace that had held since 1918 was collapsing. In Washington, politicians argued over America's role. In New York, families with relatives overseas waited anxiously for news. At Mar-a-Lago, the parties continued. Marjorie kept her winter seasons going through the late 1930s with almost stubborn consistency. The guest list shifted slightly. Fewer European visitors, more American industrialists and military officers. But the rituals stayed the same. Dinners at 8, dancing until midnight. The quiet assumption that this world, this particular arrangement of wealth and privilege, would last forever. The illusion was powerful, partly because Marjorie herself believed it, or chose to. She had built something she thought was permanent, something that would outlast fashion and crisis. Mar-a-Lago was stone and marble, craftsmanship and art. In her mind, these were the things that endured. These were the things that mattered. But permanence, it turned out, was more complicated than architecture. When America entered World War II in December 1941, everything shifted. Palm Beach, like the rest of the country, mobilized. Young men from staff families enlisted or were drafted. Rationing reached even the grandest houses. Sugar, butter, gasoline, all suddenly limited. The Coast Guard established patrols along Florida's beaches, watching for German submarines reportedly operating in Atlantic waters uncomfortably close to shore. Mar-a-Lago itself was offered to the government as a possible site for military use. The offer was declined. The mansion was too conspicuous, too hard to defend, too impractical for real military operations. But Marjorie threw herself into wartime efforts with genuine energy. She funded medical supplies. She hosted benefits to sell war bonds. She turned parts of her other estates into recovery spaces for wounded soldiers. The war years exposed something unexpected about the mansion: its vulnerability. The stone walls and gold ceilings that had seemed so solid were, in reality, fragile, dependent on constant care and maintenance that wartime conditions made difficult. Staff shortages meant some rooms went uncleaned and unused. Salt air, no longer fought back with the same intensity, began to eat away at metal and stone. Complex mechanical systems needed parts that were now unavailable, diverted to war production. For the first time since its completion, Mar-a-Lago began to show its age. Marjorie was aging too. By 1945, she was 58 years old. Her third marriage, to Joseph Davies, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, was strained. Her daughter Nadanaya was building a life of her own, showing little interest in the social universe Marjorie had struggled so hard to enter. Her other children were similarly distant, absorbed in their own paths and concerns. The question that had haunted Marjorie for decades began to change shape. No longer, will they accept me? But instead, who will want this when I am gone? The answer was not obvious. Mar-a-Lago was magnificent, but magnificence came with a price. The yearly maintenance alone ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Property taxes were substantial. Staff payrolls were heavy. Heat, electricity, water, repairs. The mansion consumed money at a rate that strained even Marjorie's fortune. And the social world it had been built to impress was changing. The old families, the old gatekeepers, were slowly losing their grip on American high society. New money was becoming acceptable. Not breakfast cereal money, but Hollywood money, oil money, eventually technology money. The rules were shifting, But they were shifting too late for Marjorie, and in ways that left her own position uncertain. More troubling still was this: her children did not want it. The mansion embodied Marjorie's dream, Marjorie's answer to Marjorie's particular wound. Her children had their own dreams, their own hurts, their own solutions. None of them wanted to inherit the burden of a palace that demanded constant attention, constant expense, constant emotional and financial effort. Marjorie slowly began to think about what came next. What happened to a house like this when its creator was no longer there to will it into relevance? Could it realistically pass into private hands? Should it be donated, preserved as some kind of monument? Or was it simply too expensive, too impractical, too tied to one woman's moment in history to survive her intact? There were no simple answers. So Marjorie did what she had often done when faced with problems that seemed unsolvable. She carried on as if everything were fine. The winter seasons resumed after the war. The parties came back. The guest lists were tended with the same care. The staff continued their invisible work. But something fundamental had shifted. The permanence she thought she had poured into stone and marble revealed itself as temporary after all. Lago would outlast her, certainly. The building was too solid to simply vanish. Yet what it would become, who would claim it, and whether any trace of her original vision would survive, all of that was suddenly in doubt. The mansion stood on its narrow strip of land, beautiful and costly, and increasingly out of step with the times, waiting for a future its creator could no longer clearly imagine. 5. The gift no one wanted. Marjorie made her decision in 1973. She was 86 years old. Her health was declining. Her fortune, though still large, had been drained by decades of maintaining multiple estates, supporting causes, and living at a level almost no one could afford. The question of Mar-a-Lago's future could not be postponed any longer. Her solution reflected both her patriotism and her enduring hope that the mansion might finally gain the national importance she had always imagined for it. She would give Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. In her mind, it would become a true winter White House, a presidential retreat where American leaders could host foreign dignitaries in surroundings that displayed the country's wealth and cultural sophistication. The idea was not without precedent. Presidents had relied on private retreats before. Franklin Roosevelt had Warm Springs. Harry Truman escaped to Key West. So the concept of a formal winter White House in Florida seemed to Marjorie both logical and generous. She drew up the will. The terms were clear. Upon her death, Mar-a-Lago would pass to the federal government to be used as a presidential retreat or as housing for visiting foreign leaders. The furnishings, the art, the carefully assembled collections, everything would stay with the house. Marjorie was offering not just a structure, but a complete world, fully staged and ready for use. She died on September 12, 1973. The lawyers began to execute the will. The government began its review. The review did not unfold the way Marjorie would have hoped. The National Park Service sent representatives to inspect the property. Their report, when it arrived, was thorough and brutal. Yes, Mar-a-Lago was beautiful. Yes, it was historic. Yes, it was an important example of 1920s architecture and design. But, and this was the decisive issue, it was spectacularly impractical as a government facility. The maintenance costs were staggering. Early estimates suggested the government would need to spend between $1 and $2 million every year just to keep the place in basic operating condition. That figure covered routine upkeep, utilities, staff salaries, security, and insurance. It did not include major repairs or renovations that would inevitably be needed over time. Security was another major problem. Mar-a-Lago sat on a narrow strip of land with ocean on one side and lake on the other. The property had multiple access points. The perimeter was long and hard to control. Making it secure enough for presidential use would require heavy modifications: walls, gates, surveillance systems, guard posts, that would both cost additional millions and fundamentally change the character of the estate. The location itself posed risks. Palm Beach was effectively an island, tied to the mainland by a few easily blocked bridges. In an emergency, a hurricane, a security threat, a medical crisis, evacuating the president and staff would be complicated. The nearest major airport was several miles away. The nearest significant military installation was even farther. Then there were the neighbors. Palm Beach residents had tolerated Marjorie's parties because she was, in the end, one of them. Wealthy, established, and part of their social world. A permanent federal presence with checkpoints, security cordons, and constant activity was another matter entirely. The town council made it clear that a major government facility would not be welcome. The Park Service concluded, regretfully but firmly, that accepting the gift would be financially reckless. Mar-a-Lago was too expensive, too impractical, too difficult to secure and maintain. Their recommendation was to decline. In 1981, after years of legal maneuvering and debate, the government formally returned Mar-a-Lago to Marjorie's estate. The dream of a winter White House ended before it could truly begin. The rejection must have stung, even after death. Marjorie had spent her life building something that would command respect, something that no one could easily ignore or dismiss. In that sense, she had succeeded. But she had not succeeded in making anyone actually want it. The problem Mar-a-Lago faced was the same problem that had shadowed Marjorie herself: excess. The house was simply too much, too large, too costly, too demanding, too tied to one woman's very specific idea of grandeur. What worked as a personal statement of wealth turned into a burden the moment someone else was asked to take responsibility for it. The estate executors found themselves staring at an uncomfortable question. If the United States government did not want this property, who would? Through much of the early 1980s, the mansion sat mostly empty. A skeleton staff kept the basic systems running. Wings of the house were closed off. Dust gathered on surfaces that had once gleamed under candlelight. The gardens, without constant attention, slipped toward wildness. Salt water kept up its slow, patient work of corrosion. Mar-a-Lago was beautiful, vacant, and increasingly desperate for someone, anyone, willing to shoulder its extreme costs and complexity. That someone, improbably, was already circling. He was young, ambitious, obsessed with publicity, and convinced that he could turn almost anything into a profitable brand. His name was Donald Trump, and he was about to remake Marjorie's dream into something she never could have imagined. 6. Enter the showman. Donald Trump first saw Mar-a-Lago in 1985. He was 39 years old, riding high on New York real estate deals, and hungry for something that would prove he was not just rich, but important. Trump Tower had opened 3 years earlier. The Trump name glowed on buildings across Manhattan. But New York, for all its glamour, was crowded with other developers, other dynasties, other claims to greatness. Florida seemed different. Open space, constant sunshine, and the chance to acquire something unique. A property with history and prestige already built in. Trump's first move was characteristically aggressive. He offered $5 million for Mar-a-Lago, a fraction of what it had cost to build, and a number that reflected the property's core problem. As a practical investment, it was almost worthless. The estate executors, reportedly offended, turned him down. Trump answered by buying the beach parcel directly in front of Mar-a-Lago for $2 million. His declared plan was to put high-rise condominiums on that strip, blocking the mansion's ocean view and wiping out much of its remaining value. Whether he truly meant to follow through or mainly wanted leverage is still unclear. The leverage worked. Faced with the prospect of their oceanfront masterpiece becoming a landlocked relic behind concrete towers, the executors came back to the table. In 1985, Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago and its furnishings for roughly $8 million in total. Still a steep discount compared to the original cost of construction, but apparently the best realistic offer. Trump's immediate problem was the same one that had defeated the federal government. The property burned through money at an incredible rate. Maintenance costs stayed in the hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. Property taxes were heavy. As a private residence, the mansion was absurdly oversized. It demanded a level of staff and spending that even Trump considered excessive. His answer fit his particular talent for turning status into cash. He would convert Mar-a-Lago into a private club. The transformation began in 1995. Trump reportedly spent around $3 million on renovations, upgrading electrical systems, modernizing kitchens, refurbishing rooms that had decayed through years of bare minimum upkeep. Yet the core of the house remained the same. The ballroom, the dining room, the gold leaf ceilings, the imported tiles, all stayed. Trump understood that what he was selling was not comfort or convenience, but access to a very specific fantasy. The club model was simple. Members paid an initiation fee, at first $100,000, later raised to $200,000, plus annual dues of about $14,000. In return, they received access to the property, the right to dine in the mansion's restaurants, use of the pool and beach, and most importantly, the social capital that came with being able to say they belonged to Mar-a-Lago. Trump marketed the club relentlessly, interviews with architecture magazines, tours for society writers, carefully staged photo spreads showing him on site, hinting that members would enjoy proximity to celebrity and power. The message was sharp and consistent. Mar-a-Lago was not just a club, it was an inner circle, and membership meant you had arrived. Palm Beach society was not universally charmed. The town already had its own pillars. The Bath and Tennis Club, the Everglades Club, with histories stretching back decades and membership lists guarded like state secrets. Those clubs had rejected Trump's own applications in the past, reportedly because of his flashy persona and his ties to casino gambling. Trump's counter-move was to brand Mar-a-Lago as deliberately different. While the established clubs maintained policies that excluded Jews and African Americans, practices that were increasingly controversial but still present, Trump made Mar-a-Lago explicitly open to members regardless of religion or race. Whether this sprang from principle, strategy, or some mix of both remains debated. Whatever the motive, the strategy worked. Within a few years, Mar-a-Lago had several hundred members. The initiation fees alone brought in tens of millions of dollars. The annual dues created a predictable revenue stream. Trump had solved Mar-a-Lago's fundamental problem. He had found a way to make other people pay to maintain Marjorie's dream. Yet the club was never just a business. From the start, Trump used Mar-a-Lago as a stage for his own ambitions. He hosted lavish parties engineered to generate headlines. He invited politicians, athletes, entertainers, anyone whose presence signaled power or fame. He gave interviews from the property, always framed by opulent backgrounds that reinforced the image he wanted to project. Mar-a-Lago was becoming what Marjorie had perhaps always imagined, a place where important things happened, where important people gathered, where decisions that mattered were made. The open question was whether those events, those people, those decisions would ultimately honor the mansion, or twist it into something darker than Marjorie could ever have pictured. The answer was on its way, but it would require another decade and an election that stunned the world. 7. The Winter White House reconsidered. The election of 2016 changed everything. When Donald Trump won the presidency in November, defeating Hillary Clinton in a result that stunned both pollsters and pundits, Mar-a-Lago's status shifted overnight. The property that the federal government had once rejected as too impractical, too expensive, too problematic for presidential use was about to become exactly that. Not officially, but in practice. Trump made his intentions clear immediately. He would spend significant time at Mar-a-Lago during his presidency. He would host foreign leaders there. He would conduct government business from the property. The winter White House that Marjorie had imagined in her will was finally being realized, though in a way she never could have pictured. The transformation brought complications almost at once. Security demands exploded. The Secret Service descended on Palm Beach, turning what had been a luxurious resort into something much closer to a fortified compound. Checkpoints appeared on surrounding streets. Coast Guard boats patrolled the offshore waters. Airspace above the property became restricted. Agents screened everyone entering, including club members who had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for the illusion of effortless, privileged access. The costs were staggering. But unlike with Marjorie's original offer to the government, these costs were not Trump's problem. Federal taxpayers paid for securing the property, protecting the president, and managing the logistics of running parts of the U.S. government out of a private club. Estimates varied, but reporting suggested that each presidential visit cost several $million in security and operational expenses. Palm Beach residents, who had tolerated the club with mixed feelings, now faced a reality far more disruptive than anything they had imagined. Roads closed whenever the president was in residence. Traffic snarled around security checkpoints. The quiet, carefully curated exclusivity of the town was repeatedly shattered by motorcades, helicopters, and the constant noise of presidential machinery. Lawsuits followed. Neighbors went to court over noise, traffic, and what they said were falling property values. The town council held contentious meetings about Trump's legal residency. Mar-a-Lago's deed reportedly included a clause limiting it to club use rather than permanent residence, a restriction Trump was now clearly challenging. These fights played out in local hearings and national headlines, turning the property from a glamorous backdrop into an ongoing legal and political battlefield. Yet the most important change was not logistical, but symbolic. Mar-a-Lago became a shorthand for everything that divided America in the Trump era. For supporters, the mansion embodied success and achievement. Trump had taken a property no one else wanted and made it profitable. He had become president while still owning an aeon empire of buildings. The gold leaf ceilings and marble floors read as proof of American prosperity and confidence. Hosting foreign leaders at Mar-a-Lago seemed to them like a demonstration that private enterprise could match or surpass the formal White House in style and comfort. For critics, Mar-a-Lago represented the worst possible merging of public office and private profit. Trump owned the club. He made money from memberships and events. Foreign governments and corporate interests looking for favor could buy access simply by joining the club or hosting functions there. The membership fee doubled to $200,000 after the election, a price that now bought not just social prestige, but potential proximity to the President of the United States. The ethical concerns were serious and largely unprecedented. Club members could overhear sensitive conversations. Foreign leaders stayed in rooms that belonged to Trump's business. Government matters were discussed at dinner tables surrounded by paying customers. The line between official duty and private business blurred, then largely disappeared. Specific incidents brought those worries into sharp focus. In February of 2017, Trump hosted Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at Mar-a-Lago. During dinner on the outdoor terrace, surrounded by club members, word arrived that North Korea had launched a ballistic missile. Trump and Abe discussed the situation at the table, while members watched and took photos on their phones. Documents were reportedly visible on the table. Security protocols that would have been mandatory inside the White House seemed absent or loosely enforced. The episode triggered outrage. Congressional Democrats demanded investigations. Ethics experts called it a shocking breach of basic security practice. Even some Republicans expressed unease, though most stayed publicly supportive. Trump brushed off the criticism as partisan attack. Mar-a-Lago was secure, he insisted. Members were vetted. Nothing improper had taken place. The entire controversy, he argued, was the invention of opponents who hated him and resented his success. But the incident revealed something deeper. Mar-a-Lago's identity had shifted yet again. It was no longer just a mansion, or even just a high-end club. It had become a stage where presidential power, private money, political symbolism, and genuine national security risks collided in ways no other building in American history had experienced. The estate that Marjorie had built to prove her importance had finally become important on a scale she never imagined. But that importance carried a darkness she never would have chosen, a darkness that was about to deepen. The worst chapter was still ahead, and it would arrive in cardboard boxes. 8 boxes in the ballroom. The boxes arrived in January 2021. When Donald Trump left the White House after losing the 2020 election to Joe Biden, he took with him something no former president had ever taken on that scale. Thousands of pages of government documents. Some were routine correspondence. Some were administrative records. And some, according to later federal investigations, were classified materials ranging from confidential to top secret. Documents touching on nuclear capabilities, defense plans, intelligence sources, and sensitive diplomatic communications. These papers traveled from Washington to Mar-a-Lago in ordinary cardboard boxes. There were reportedly about 15 boxes at first, though the exact number would later be disputed. They were stored initially in a basement storage room, then moved to other spots on the property, including, according to federal prosecutors, the ballroom where Marjorie's guests had once danced beneath gold leaf ceilings. At first, almost no one outside Trump's orbit knew the documents were there. But by early 2022, the National Archives, the federal agency responsible for preserving presidential records, realized that significant material was missing. Officials requested its return. Trump's representatives negotiated. Some documents were sent back in January 2022. But archives staff immediately noticed classified markings on materials that should never have left secure government facilities. The Justice Department opened a criminal investigation. Subpoenas followed. Trump's attorneys searched Mar-a-Lago and told the government that all classified materials had now been returned. In June 2022, they provided a sworn certification saying exactly that. The certification was false. Federal investigators had evidence that classified documents were still at Mar-a-Lago. On August 8, 2022, FBI agents executed a search warrant at the property. The search itself was historic. No former president had ever faced such an action. Agents spent hours inside Mar-a-Lago, moving from room to room, photographing spaces, and seizing materials. When they were done, they had recovered more than 100 additional classified documents, some marked at the highest levels of secrecy. Photographs later released in court filings showed the scope of the problem. Files spread across the floor of what appeared to be a storage area. Classification stamps clearly visible. Top secret. SCI. Sensitive compartmented information. Documents that, if exposed to foreign intelligence services, could allegedly compromise American operations and put lives at risk. All of this had been stored inside a building that hosted hundreds of club members, event staff, maintenance workers, and guests. a building used for weddings and corporate parties, a building on an easily accessible barrier island connected to the mainland by public roads and a bridge. Trump's reaction was immediate and furious. He called the search a raid, an assault, an abuse of power. He claimed the FBI had planted evidence. He insisted the documents were declassified, even though no formal proof of declassification emerged. He argued that as president, he had absolute authority to take whatever he wanted with him. His supporters closed ranks. To them, the search became proof of a deep state conspiracy. Protesters gathered outside Mar-a-Lago's gates. Conservative media attacked the FBI's motives and tactics. Republican politicians denounced the Justice Department and framed the investigation as purely political. Critics saw something very different. A former president who had removed classified materials resisted returning them, allowed his lawyers to make false statements, and stored sensitive intelligence in a social club where day-to-day security was handled by private employees trained in hospitality, not counterintelligence. Federal prosecutors convened a grand jury. In June 2023, Trump was indicted on 37 counts related to mishandling classified documents and obstructing justice. More charges were added later. The case was assigned to Judge Aileen Cannon in the Southern District of Florida. The trial was set, then pushed back. Legal motions piled up. Trump's legal team attacked the search warrant, the charges, the special counsel's authority, almost every structural piece of the prosecution. The case became one more battlefield in the larger political war around Trump, with each side completely convinced of its own righteousness and the other side's corruption. Yet beneath the politics and the spin, one simple physical fact remained. Classified documents had been stored in a mansion built for parties. The ballroom at the center of the controversy had witnessed nearly a century of Mar-a-Lago's transformations. It had hosted Marjorie's carefully staged dinners. It had seen Trump's club galas. It had welcomed diplomats during the presidency. Now, in legal filings and news reports, it was described as either a crime scene or the focus of a witch hunt, depending entirely on who was talking. The estate that had always been about appearances, about projecting power and importance, now sat at the heart of questions about whether that power had been abused, and whether those appearances had hidden something genuinely dangerous. Mar-a-Lago had finally reached maximum visibility and significance. The remaining questions were what that significance would cost, and who would ultimately pay the price. Those answers were still unsettled, suspended in legal arguments and political conflict. While the mansion carried on in its strange, overlapping roles, social club, political symbol, active investigation site, and monument to American excess in all its complicated forms. 9. After the sirens, who pays for dreams? The legal proceedings continued, but life at Mar-a-Lago went on. Weddings were still booked in the ballroom. Club members still dined on the terrace overlooking the ocean. Event staff still arranged flowers and polished silverware. The machinery that had kept the mansion running since Marjorie's time, the invisible work, the careful maintenance, the constant attention to detail, continued regardless of headlines or investigations. This persistence raised a harder question. What happens to a place when its symbolism overwhelms its reality? When the stories told about it, competing, contradictory, politically charged, start to matter more than the physical space itself? Mar-a-Lago had become all of these things at once: a working social club, a former president's residence, a site of federal investigation, a symbol brandished by both political tribes to prove opposite arguments, and yet it was also still a building that needed daily care from people whose names almost never appeared in any of those stories. The staff who maintained Mar-a-Lago in 2023 stood in a line that stretched back to the 1920s. Housekeepers cleaned the same rooms their predecessors had cleaned. Groundskeepers tended descendants of the same palm trees. Kitchen crews prepared meals in spaces that had been modernized over decades, but kept the same basic purpose: feeding wealthy people who came to be seen in a place they believed mattered. Those workers experienced Mar-a-Lago's controversies very differently from club members or television commentators. For them, the mansion was not first a symbol, it was an employer. Legal trouble meant the risk of cutbacks. Protests and counter-protests meant navigating crowds and checkpoints just to get to a shift. Media attention meant reporters occasionally approaching them for comments they were contractually forbidden to give. Their relationship to the property was fundamentally different from everyone else's. Club members paid for proximity to prestige. Politicians used the location to signal alliances. Trump owned it as both home and asset. The workers needed it to keep operating so they could earn wages that, while reportedly better than many service jobs in Palm Beach, still looked small compared to the fortunes on display around them. This economic truth had been there since Marjorie's era, but it became more visible and more uncomfortable as Mar-a-Lago's political meaning grew. The same building that symbolized American success to some and American corruption to others was, for its workers, simply a site of labor, hard, often unseen work that made every party, every summit, every photo opportunity possible. The historical echo was hard to miss. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago with the help of craftsmen whose names vanished from the record. Trump kept it running with employees whose identities stayed just as anonymous unless something went wrong. A security lapse, a dispute, an offhand remark to a reporter. The mansion consumed their time and effort while directing attention upward toward owners, guests, and the dramas playing out in the decorated rooms. Beyond the immediate staff, the mansion's impact rippled outward in ways that were difficult to measure. Palm Beach residents dealt with traffic closures and security delays. Local businesses sometimes gained from the influx of visitors and sometimes lost customers who wanted to avoid the chaos. Property values near the estate shifted based on whether being close to presidential activity was seen as a perk or a headache. There were environmental costs too, rarely mentioned in political arguments, but impossible to ignore. Keeping 17 acres of perfectly manicured grounds alive in Florida demanded huge amounts of water. Climate control for a structure that size required constant energy. The estate sat on a barrier island, increasingly vulnerable to rising sea levels and stronger hurricanes. The same climate forces that would sooner or later force choices about whether and how to defend a house, built almost at the water's edge. All of these concrete realities existed beneath and alongside the symbolism. Mar-a-Lago was at once a monument to excess and a workplace, a political weapon and a fragile building on eroding land, a lightning rod for national arguments, and a place where people simply tried to finish their shifts and get home. To understand the mansion's full story, you had to hold all of these perspectives together, not picking one true narrative, but accepting that Mar-a-Lago contained many, that its meaning was fractured, and that different people lived inside that meaning in radically different ways. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago to answer a personal question about belonging and significance. The building had achieved a level of significance far beyond anything she imagined. But the question of belonging, who belonged there, who was kept out, who gained, and who quietly paid, remained as tangled and unresolved as ever. The mansion stood on its narrow strip of land, still beautiful despite scandal, still expensive, still argued over, still demanding constant labor from people who would never own it, and constant commentary from people who would never set foot inside. The ocean continued its patient assault on the seawall. Tourists kept snapping photos from public beaches. Protesters and supporters repeated their rituals outside the gates, and inside, the daily work continued. Floors mopped, meals prepared, light fixtures dusted, gardens trimmed. The dream Marjorie built had survived, but survival was not the same thing as victory. The question now was whether anyone Owners, guests, critics, or citizens watching from afar would learn anything from Mar-a-Lago's long, strange journey from private fantasy to national flashpoint. Part 10. The Mansion as Mirror. The lessons were there. Whether anyone chose to see them was another question entirely. Mar-a-Lago's nearly century-long story reflected America's contradictions with uncomfortable clarity. The mansion was a mirror, and what it showed depended entirely on who was looking and what they were willing to admit. For some, Mar-a-Lago illustrated American exceptionalism at its most dazzling. A determined woman with money and ambition built something extraordinary. An entrepreneur rescued it from decay and turned it into a profitable venture. A president used it as a backdrop to project American power and confidence to visiting leaders. In that version, the narrative was about private enterprise succeeding where government failed, about individuals creating value and beauty through vision and willpower. For others, the very same sequence of events told a much darker tale. A wealthy heiress built a monument to herself while the country struggled through depression and inequality. A businessman monetized access to power in ways that blurred every ethical line. A president merged personal profit and public duty so completely that distinguishing between them became almost impossible. In that telling, the story was about unchecked wealth, corroded institutions, and elites playing by rules no one else could access. Both narratives contained truth. Both left out crucial pieces. The real story of Mar-a-Lago was messier and more layered than either political camp wanted to acknowledge. It was a story about labor. Generations of workers whose skill and effort built and preserved a place they could not afford to inhabit as guests. It was a story about ambition. Marjorie's desperate attempt to purchase acceptance, Trump's relentless hunger for attention, and the way buildings become vessels for human needs that no amount of architecture can fully satisfy. It was also a story about class in America, about the distance between those who serve and those who are served. A distance that barely shifted no matter which wealthy name appeared on the deed or which party held the White House. The workers who carved stone and set tile in the late 1920s and the staff who changed linens and carried trays in the early 2020s occupied strikingly similar rungs on the social ladder, separated by a century, but joined by the same dynamic. Their labor underpinned someone else's luxury. It was a story about how Americans mythologize wealth. Marjorie believed that overwhelming display would force respect. Trump believed that surrounding himself with opulence would prove his importance. Both were partly right and partly wrong. The mansion did command attention. It did signal power. It did generate a certain kind of significance. But it also exposed the hollowness at the center of power that exists mostly for show. The way gold leaf ceilings and imported marble can feel impressive and empty at the same time. Beautiful and strangely meaningless. The mansion revealed, too, how easily public and private interests fuse together once wealth reaches a certain level. Marjorie's attempt to give Mar-a-Lago to the government failed, but Trump's use of it as a presidential stage succeeded, creating exactly the kind of conflicts her rejected gift had been meant to avoid. The building exposed gaps in ethics rules, in security assumptions, in the unwritten norms about how presidents should behave, and where the boundaries of acceptable conduct really lie. Most of all, Mar-a-Lago's story highlighted what Americans chose to notice, and what they quietly ignored. The classified documents saga triggered intense political warfare, but the decades of invisible labor that kept the mansion running barely registered in public debate. Legal fights over Trump's residency generated headlines, but the environmental fragility of lavish estates on barrier islands received little sustained attention. Commentators dissected the price of club memberships in detail, while the pay and conditions of the workers who made the club possible were rarely examined with the same intensity. Those patterns of attention echoed broader national habits. Drama traveled fast. Spectacle drew cameras. Clashes between powerful figures felt urgent, because power always did. The slow, structural questions. Who did which work for how much? Who carried which risks so others could enjoy which comforts? Were quieter, harder to turn into outrage, easier to leave in the background. Mar-a-Lago had become a symbol, but symbols flatten and distort by design. The mansion was not simply good or evil, not only a monument to success or just a temple of corruption. It was both and neither. A complicated place, with a complicated past, that refused to shrink down to a single clean meaning. The house had outlived its creator. It would almost certainly outlive its current owner. The unresolved question was what it would become next, and whether that next chapter would be shaped deliberately, or simply happen by inertia, determined by whoever had enough money and ego to claim it. Buildings do not choose their owners or their roles. People do. The decisions made about Mar-a-Lago, whether to preserve it, repurpose it, regulate it, condemn it, or simply let it continue its strange hybrid existence, would say a great deal about American values and priorities. The mirror stood there, set in stone and marble. The real test was whether anyone would face it honestly, seeing not just the version of America they preferred, but the full reflection, the contradictions, the costs, and the real people whose labor and lives had been poured into every gilded surface and polished floor. 11. Responsibility and what could be different. Looking honestly at the reflection was only the first step. The harder question was what to do with what you saw. Mar-a-Lago existed inside a legal and ethical framework that had never been designed for a place like this. A former president owning a commercial property, while potentially running for office again, created conflicts that existing rules could barely describe, let alone regulate. A private social club that had served as a presidential venue sat in a gray zone between business and state, between leisure and official function, that no current regulation really covered. Yet the problems Mar-a-Lago exposed were not at their core about one house or one man. They were structural, baked into systems that treated extraordinary wealth as automatically legitimate and assumed that financial success signaled virtue, competence, or destiny. The mansion's history pointed to several areas where American society might need to rethink its assumptions. First, the relationship between wealth and political power demanded a clearer, more honest look. The fact that membership at Mar-a-Lago reportedly provided proximity to a sitting president was not a glitch in the system. It was an extreme example of how money routinely buys access. Campaign donations, lobbying budgets, think tank funding, revolving doors between regulators and the industries they oversee. All of these are channels through which wealth turns into influence. Mar-a-Lago simply made the process more literal and easier to see. Fixing this would require structural changes, not just outrage. Stricter ethics rules with real teeth. Enforcement mechanisms that actually carried consequences. Transparency requirements that exposed who met with whom, where, and for what purpose. It would mean acknowledging that proximity to power is itself a valuable asset, that access is a kind of currency, and that allowing it to be openly bought creates a system in which government inevitably leans toward those who can pay the price of entry. Second, the treatment of labor needed a more honest reckoning. Every mansion, every luxury resort, every carefully curated display of wealth rested on the work of people whose contributions were routinely undervalued and invisible. The public fights over Mar-a-Lago were staged around ownership, law, and symbolism, while the workers who kept the building functioning barely appeared in the story at all. That invisibility was part of the design. It supported the comforting fantasy that wealth creates itself, that luxury springs naturally from talent and effort, rather than from the organized extraction of value from other people's time and bodies. Bringing the workers into the frame, knowing their names, understanding their schedules and protections, ensuring they received fair pay and basic dignity, would require admitting uncomfortable truths about how American comfort is actually produced and who is carrying the weight. Third, the preservation and purpose of historic properties needed rethinking. Mar-a-Lago was architecturally significant regardless of its political baggage. Marjorie's Spanish tiles, the carved ceilings, the eccentric but meticulous design choices, all of that had genuine cultural and historical value. But that value was locked behind membership fees and security gates, accessible mostly to those who could write very large checks. There were other paths. Across the country, historic homes had been turned into museums, educational sites, archives, and public spaces. Those conversions recognized that some buildings matter beyond their role as private assets, that their stories belong to more people than just whoever holds the deed at a given moment. Mar-a-Lago could, in theory, tell stories about the Gilded Age, about architecture as self-mythology, about labor and class, about the collision of wealth and democracy. Making that happen would take political will that does not yet exist. But Mar-a-Lago will not stay exactly as it is forever. Through sale, inheritance, legal judgment, or even storms and rising seas, its status will eventually change. Planning for that change, thinking beyond simply handing it to the next billionaire, could open the door to uses that serve more than a few hundred club members. Fourth, and maybe most fundamentally, Americans needed more nuanced ways of thinking about wealth itself. The habit of treating large fortunes as straightforward proof of merit, as evidence of intelligence, discipline, or moral worth, obscured the messy reality. Wealth almost always came from a mix of inheritance, timing, existing connections, the labor of others, government infrastructure, legal protections, and yes, sometimes genuine skill and hard work, but never those alone. Marjorie inherited a cereal empire. Trump inherited millions and a real estate network from his father. Neither started from nothing, though both leaned into versions of that myth. Those myths mattered because they turned inequality into a morality play, making it seem earned, natural, almost inevitable, instead of the product of policy choices, historical advantages, and the compounding of privilege. More honest stories about wealth. Stories that include inheritances, tax codes, land use laws, race, gender, immigration status, and simple luck, would not erase inequality. But they might open space to ask whether the current distribution of resources actually serves the country well, or whether different arrangements could work better for more people. None of these conversations are easy. They challenge deeply rooted American stories about individualism, meritocracy, and the moral beauty of accumulation. They ask people who benefit from the current system to admit that the game has never been purely fair, that personal success sits on top of structures many others never had a chance to use. Mar-a-Lago cannot force anyone to have these conversations, but its history offers concrete entry points. Specific, undeniable examples that make abstract issues visible. Who gets access and why? Who does the work and for how much? How public power and private wealth intertwine inside a single set of walls. The open question is whether Americans will use those entry points or keep fighting over symbols while leaving the underlying structures, the ones Mar-a-Lago has exposed so clearly, exactly as they are. 12. Waves on the same wall. The structures would outlast the arguments, just as the mansion had outlasted its builders. Dawn reached Mar-a-Lago the same way it had for nearly a century. Light spread over the Atlantic, touching the waves first, then the sand, then the sea wall that separated ocean from property. The same wall workers had poured and stacked in the 1920s, repaired after storms, patched and reinforced again and again, but never changed in its basic purpose, holding back water that would otherwise reclaim the land. The ocean was patient. It could wait. Inside the mansion, daily routines started up once more. Security guards changed shifts. Kitchen staff came in to prepare breakfast. Maintenance workers checked systems that always needed watching. The building demanded care, as it always had, as it always would. That continuity was perhaps the clearest truth about Mar-a-Lago. Beneath the controversies and symbolism, beneath the political fights and legal filings, it remained a physical structure that survived only through physical labor. Headlines shifted. Owners would, sooner or later, change. The meaning attached to the place rose and fell with cultural storms. But the work of keeping it standing went on, done by people whose names would never appear in the history books, whose perspectives would not shape the narratives, whose daily effort made every other story possible. Those workers understood something observers often missed. Buildings are not really about the names on the deeds or even the architects on the plans. Buildings are about the ongoing negotiation between human effort and physical reality. Stone crumbles, paint peels, wiring fails, gardens choke with weeds if no one tends them. The mansion's survival depended not on grand visions or dramatic moments, but on quiet, repetitive tasks. Noticing what was starting to break and fixing it, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Marjorie understood this, at least in part. She hired staff, funded upkeep, paid for restoration. But she saw those things as a means to an end, the price of keeping her dream intact. She did not fully grasp, or did not want to grasp, that the work was the substance and the dream was the reflection. The building's reality was the labor that sustained it. Everything else was projection cast onto that surface. Trump understood it differently, but not more deeply. He treated the mansion as an asset, a brand, a stage set. He knew it required maintenance, but framed that as overhead, a cost to be minimized, never as the central activity that gave the place real meaning. His relationship to Mar-a-Lago was extractive. What could it do for him? How could it amplify his image? What value could he pull out before he moved on? Neither view fully honored what the building actually was: a long, ongoing collaboration between the people who imagined it, the people who built it, the people who kept it running, and the natural forces, wind, water, sun, salt, that constantly tested how long human effort could hold the line. The ocean kept pushing at the seawall. Climate change was speeding erosion along Florida's coasts. Sea levels were rising in measurable, documented inches. Storms were growing stronger. Within decades, possibly within years, Mar-a-Lago could face a real existential threat not from politics or court cases, but from physics. Water creeping higher, land sinking lower. The basic instability of building elaborate structures on narrow barrier islands in an unstable climate. That threat was democratic in a way human conflicts were not. The ocean did not care about property values, political slogans, or historical significance. It would come for Mar-a-Lago the same way it came for modest cottages and public beaches, testing every foundation, finding every weakness, claiming whatever could not be defended. At some point, the seawall would fail. Maybe it could be rebuilt, raised, armored with new engineering. Maybe technology would delay the outcome. Or maybe not. Maybe future generations would look at photographs of Mar-a-Lago the way people now look at images of vanished coastal towns. Beautiful once, gone now, taken back by forces larger than any individual's wealth or will. If that loss comes, it will teach lessons the political scandals never could. It will show that grandeur is temporary, that power has limits, that nature operates on scales that make human drama look small. The same ocean that made Mar-a-Lago's views priceless would prove stronger than the walls built to frame them. But that is the future. The present offered quieter lessons, available to anyone willing to really look. The lesson of continuity, that work goes on regardless of headlines, that ordinary effort sustains extraordinary places, that maintenance, not spectacle, is what keeps the world from falling apart. The lesson of complexity, that places hold multiple truths at once, that a single building can be both beautiful and compromised, admirable and troubling, and that history is never simple enough to fit cleanly into one side's story. The lesson of consequence, that private choices have public effects, that personal ambition shapes collective reality, that the past is not safely sealed away behind us, but woven into the present, guiding what feels possible and what feels inevitable. None of these lessons require expertise to understand. They require only attention, the willingness to see Mar-a-Lago not just as a symbol to win an argument with, but as a real location with a real past, constructed by real people, maintained by real labor, sitting in a real environment that will ultimately decide how long it can remain. 13. What we choose to remember. Attention was a choice, and choices about what to remember shaped what the future would inherit. Mar-a-Lago's story would be told and retold, but which version would last? Would it be the tale of Marjorie's social ambition, a woman building a palace to prove her worth? Would it be Trump's transformation of the estate into a political stage, the winter White House that finally came into being but generated more controversy than prestige? Would it be the classified documents saga, boxes in a ballroom, the moment when a mansion became evidence in a federal prosecution? Or would it be something else? A version that included all of these threads but refused to crown any single one as the whole truth? The danger with symbolic places was that they became containers for whatever meanings people needed them to hold. Mar-a-Lago could stand for American excess or American achievement, corruption or entrepreneurship, class division or opportunity. Each reading could be defended with carefully chosen facts. Each served particular political or ideological goals, and each, in its own way, hid as much as it revealed. Honest memory meant resisting this flattening, insisting that places carried multiple truths even when those truths clashed or made simple judgments impossible. Mar-a-Lago was at once a remarkable work of architecture and a monument to inequality. It was both a property rescued from decay and a vehicle for blending public duty with private profit. It was a workplace for hundreds of employees and a symbol wielded in national political fights. All of these things were true at the same time. Accepting that required learning to hold contradictions without rushing to resolve them, to live with complexity without forcing it into a neat moral lesson. The historical record would preserve certain hard facts, dates of construction, chains of ownership, design details, court cases, but facts on their own were not understanding. Understanding needed context, interpretation, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about whose stories were recorded and whose were missing, whose voices were amplified and whose were muted. The workers who built and maintained Mar-a-Lago deserved to be part of that story, not as scenery, but as central figures whose labor was as essential as any architect's sketch or owner's dream. Their names, when they could be recovered, should be written down. Their working conditions should be described. Their perspectives, when they could be safely shared, should sit alongside those of presidents and heiresses and developers. The environmental setting deserved equal attention. Mar-a-Lago did not float in a vacuum. It sat on a barrier island dependent on fragile ecosystems and exposed to rising seas and stronger storms. The decision to raise elaborate permanent structures in such places reflected assumptions about human control over nature that were growing less believable with every hurricane season. Future historians might judge the whole pattern, not just Mar-a-Lago, but the broader culture of coastal luxury building it symbolized, as fundamentally misguided, a refusal to accept physical limits that climate change would eventually enforce. The economic systems that made Mar-a-Lago possible also warranted scrutiny. Marjorie's fortune came from food processing, an industry rooted in agricultural labor and mass consumer markets. Trump's money came from real estate, an industry tightly tied to banking, tax policy, zoning laws, and long histories of racial discrimination and segregation. Neither fortune was self-created. Both rested on broader structures, legal frameworks, and other people's work. Honest history named those structures instead of repeating myths of the lone, self-made genius. The cultural meanings of the mansion would keep shifting. What seemed crucial in the early 2020s might feel minor or even puzzling to observers in the early 2070s. The political storms that made the property infamous would fade as their main actors left the stage and new controversies took their place. But the building itself, if it survived, would remain. A physical artifact of early 20th century ambition and early 21st century conflict, layered with meanings that each generation would revisit and revise. That constant reinterpretation was inevitable. The real question was whether it would be careful or careless, whether future Americans would do the difficult work of understanding context and complexity, or simply project their own anxieties backward, bending history to fit present needs without regard for past realities. Education offered one of the few defenses against lazy interpretation. If Mar-a-Lago ever became a museum or historic site, possible, though far from guaranteed, it could carry several lessons at once. Architectural tours could sit beside explorations of labor history. Conversations about beauty and craftsmanship could run alongside discussions of class, race, and inequality. Admiration for design would not have to erase clear-eyed recognition of who benefited from that design and who paid for it. But education required money, institutions, and political support, none of which were automatic. It was entirely plausible that Mar-a-Lago would remain in private hands indefinitely, its story shaped by whoever owned it next, its meanings filtered through marketing needs rather than historical honesty. That outcome would not be uniquely evil. But it would be a missed chance. A decision to leave a powerful teaching tool locked inside a gated club. In the end, the choice belonged to Americans collectively, even if it was expressed through the actions of a few. The choice was not only about Mar-a-Lago's fate, but about what kind of country they wanted to sustain, what they wished to honor, what they were willing to question, what legacy they hoped to leave behind. Buildings reflected those choices back at the people who made them. Mar-a-Lago, whatever else it might be, was a mirror showing Americans things about themselves. Some flattering, some disturbing, all revealing. Whether anyone learned from that reflection depended entirely on how honestly they were willing to look. 14. Beyond Mar-a-Lago, a pattern, not an exception. The willingness to really look did not stop at a single property. Mar-a-Lago was not unique. Across the United States, similar stories had played out in different buildings with different owners, but eerily consistent patterns. The Gilded Age left behind dozens of vast estates, the Vanderbilt houses, Hearst Castle, the DuPont mansions. Each a monument to individual wealth, each built by workers whose names rarely survived, each embodying assumptions about class and power that deeply shaped American life. Many of those properties eventually became museums or public parks. The Breakers in Newport, Biltmore in North Carolina, Vizcaya in Miami, all now serve educational roles, telling their histories with varying degrees of honesty about the labor that created them and the inequality they embodied. Mar-a-Lago remained different, mostly because it stayed in private hands and became entangled with modern politics. But the deeper questions it raised about concentrated wealth, exploited labor, and the tension between private property and public interest were not unique to one mansion. They were built into American capitalism itself. The same dynamics showed up elsewhere. Tech billionaires constructed secluded compounds in Hawaii or Montana, their sprawling estates displacing local communities and consuming land and water while providing little direct public benefit. Financial executives maintained multiple homes, each requiring staff whose wages were a tiny fraction of the property values they serviced. The basic relationship between extreme wealth and everyone else had not fundamentally changed since Marjorie's era. It had simply adopted new forms, new landscapes, new justifications. To really understand Mar-a-Lago's story was to see it as part of this larger pattern. The mansion was not a bizarre outlier, but a clear example, a case study in how American society organizes around wealth, who gains from that organization, and who absorbs the cost. That recognition has consequences for the next time a controversial property dominates headlines. And there will be a next time. The questions are already waiting. Who built it? Under what conditions? For what pay? Who keeps it running? What public burdens flow from this private luxury? Where did the owner's fortune come from? Which systems enabled that accumulation? Whose needs does the property ultimately serve? Those questions apply as much to new developments as to old estates, to private residences and commercial projects, to domestic holdings and overseas real estate. The details change, but the underlying logic stays familiar. Wealth concentrated in a few hands using resources that could have served many, producing beautiful or impressive spaces that most people will never enter, depending on labor that is systematically undercompensated and rarely acknowledged. Asking these questions again and again, refusing to be blinded by marble and chandeliers, staying focused on human and environmental costs beneath the spectacle, is a discipline that reaches far beyond Mar-a-Lago. It requires skepticism toward wealth, not automatic condemnation, but real curiosity about where money comes from and what it does. It requires attention to power, not only in elections and legislation, but in property ownership, leverage over markets, and access to key decision makers. It requires the ability to see beauty and harm together, to admire craftsmanship while also naming exploitation, to recognize that human creations are almost always mixed, never purely noble or purely corrupt. This kind of analysis is hard. It is easier to praise success uncritically or denounce it totally, easier to pick a side and defend it than to sit with ambiguity and contradiction. But easy stories produce shallow understanding, and shallow understanding lets the same patterns repeat in new settings, because no one really learned from the last round. Mar-a-Lago offers a chance to learn, if people are willing to take it. Its nearly century-long arc contains lessons about ambition and excess, about labor and luxury, about how private property intersects with public interest, about how buildings both reflect and shape the societies that surround them. Those lessons travel well. They can be applied to countless other projects, decisions, and debates, but lessons need students. They require a willingness to admit that reality is more complicated than partisan talking points, that cherished assumptions might be incomplete or wrong, that systems we benefit from can also be unjust. They call for patience to understand context and for enough resilience to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of pushing them away. Whether Americans collectively have that patience and resilience is still an open question. The shouting matches around Mar-a-Lago suggest otherwise, that partisan loyalty and team identity often drown out nuance, that many people prefer tidy narratives to messy realities. that the mansion is more often used as a weapon in arguments than examined as an object of serious study. But public conversation is not destiny. Individual choices still matter. Every person who encounters Mar-a-Lago's story, through news reports, documentaries, books, or a glimpse from a distance in Palm Beach, makes decisions about what to notice, what to question, and what to care about. Those small decisions, multiplied across thousands or millions of people, gradually shape how a society understands itself and what it decides to change or preserve. The mansion cannot force those decisions. It can only sit where it has always sat. Its story visible to anyone who cares to trace it. The patterns are there. The lessons are there. The remaining question is what people will choose to do with what they see. 15. The choice before us. The choice was immediate, and it was not going away. Mar-a-Lago's story was still in motion. Legal cases moved through the courts. Political fights shifted shape. The building itself kept aging, needing repairs. The ocean inched closer, year after year. Whatever came next would grow out of decisions being made right now. In courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms, in editorial offices and comment sections, in talks between neighbors and arguments around kitchen tables, those decisions would quietly reveal what Americans actually valued. Did they care more about transparency or about privacy? About accountability or deference to wealth? About the public interest or absolute property rights? None of these choices were simple. Reasonable people disagreed, but the questions mattered because they forced into the open priorities that usually went unspoken. The mansion also posed a smaller, more personal question to anyone who ran into its story. What kind of relationship did you want to have with wealth and power? Did you want to cheer it on without hesitation? Dream of joining it? Defend it as proof of what hard work can achieve? Did you want to reject it outright? See only exploitation and excess? Flatten everything into villains and victims? Or did you want something harder? To see clearly, to admit both achievement and harm, to hold several truths in your head at once without collapsing them into a single, easy verdict. That last posture was the most demanding and the most honest. It required effort and a bit of humility. It traded comforting certainty for actual understanding, neat conclusions for better questions, quick outrage for longer engagement. Mar-a-Lago warranted that kind of attention, not because the building itself was somehow sacred, or because its story was uniquely dramatic, but because it was right there in front of everyone. A concrete example that made big, abstract issues visible. A piece of real estate where multiple strands of American life, class, race, politics, labor, environment, media, crossed in one tightly packed space. The mansion still stood on its 17 acres, holding nearly a century of accumulated history, waiting for Americans to decide what they wanted it to mean. That decision would ultimately say less about the house than about the people looking at it. What they noticed, what they brushed aside, which lessons they chose to take seriously, and which they chose to ignore. The waves kept hitting the seawall. The structure held, for now, and time moved forward, patient and relentless, giving everyone fewer excuses for pretending the choice was not theirs to make.